We're still looking at this 46 board that I pulled from the CNC industrial computer. In the last video, we threw a couple of upgrades at it, namely an AMD 5x86, 32 meg of EDO RAM and 512k of L2 cache. But what if I told you that this board might actually perform better with no cache? So with the AMD processor and the jumpers here configured for that, in the last video we discovered that the L2 here, it didn't seem to be running right. As you can see from the memory graph in SpeedSys, the first 16k, that's the L1 cache on the CPU, it's reasonably fast, although not that smooth. Then it drops away down very slow while it's running through the 512k of L2, and it picks up a little bit again at the end while it's accessing the EDO system memory. Confirmed by the results there, data cache L2 is only getting 26.41 megabytes per second, and for some reason SpeedSys is only picking up 32k of L2 cache. Now equally the processor benchmark there, that is abysmally slow for that CPU. Now the one thing we did discover last time is if we change this jumper, which I previously called JP19, it's not, it's JP23, but if we change the position of that and run that test again, well, you can see that the processor benchmark score, that recovers to where it should be, and the memory tests, well, they're certainly better, but still not quite as good as it maybe could be. Now, a few comments from the last video suggested that these SRAM chips, yes, those are SRAM, that's the DRAM. I did mix that up last time, apologies. But a few comments thought that these are going to be fake, and that's what's causing the problem. Now, as you can hopefully see there, these are labeled ISSI, IS61C 1024-10N. So these are 128K, 8-bit and 10 nanosecond. It's that 10 nanosecond that people thought makes this fake. And sure enough, if you grab a cotton bud with a little bit of acetone on it, well, you can see that the finish is coming off. They are definitely relabeled chips or refinished chips. I suppose I can't say with any certainty if they are relabeled, but you know, why else would somebody refinish them? I think the top of these has been sanded down, they've been painted, and then they've been laser etched with what we can see there. But if you do try to remove the paint, and that's that cotton bud coming out more or less clean now, you can't unfortunately make out any other writing underneath. So with no way to know if these are truly 10 nanosecond parts, or if they're maybe 12, 15, 20 nanosecond, but they are definitely real cache chips. Because while the results might have been a bit skewed there in SpeedSys, well, if we change the BIOS, if we try an award BIOS, and if you remember last time, we were only able to push this down to 3222 timings. We couldn't get it any lower, couldn't get it to 3111 or 2111. But if we change the BIOS, if we change this to an award BIOS, we can push this a lot further. But before we do that, just want to come back to these jumpers. Because that one, JP23, well, it is meant to be set to position 2-3. That's correct for that AMD CPU. And it's as described over on this website, this rather old website from 26 years ago. But this section of it here talks about the pinouts required for your AMD 5x86. And of JP23 here, well, I've traced out the 3 pins of it. Pin 2 is obviously the common pin, that's running back to the chipset. Pin 3 of it, well, that runs to pin B12 on the CPU. Pin 1 of it runs to pin J17 on the chip. But as per this website, B12, that is the cache pin, and like it says here, this pin is an output for the CPU and indicates the internal cacheability of the current bus cycle. If there's a jumper for this signal, it will connect to the cache input of the chipset. That's what we're doing here. We're connecting that cache pin from the chip through to the chipset. So what happens when we have it in the other position? Well, like I said, pin 1, of JP23 here. It's connected to pin J17 on the CPU. And if we take a look at the pinout of our AMD chip, J17 is PCD, or page cache disable, and with that jumper in that position, I think what we're actually doing there is disabling the L2 cache. So that is definitely not right. That needs to be there. Why it seems to run really slow with the AMI BIOS that's on here, well, that is a mystery to me. Now, some of the guys over on Vogons, they've been helping me out with this. Some of them thought it might be something to do with the turbo switch. That's the jumper for it there. But I have tried that in both positions multiple times, and it makes absolutely no difference to the results. It is almost like the board is being throttled somehow, but I can't seem to figure out why that's the case. So the solution is to change the BIOS. Now, I have tried multiple BIOS images, more or less every single one of them available on the RetroWeb for this chipset. And the one I've landed on is this one here, the Bectronic motherboard. Very similar looking board to what we have here. And in particular, it is the Award BIOS that I've been using. Now, it doesn't come without problems. So as you can see, board still boots okay. We get the Award BIOS. Just let me go through and set this up quickly. Okay, that's most things set up the way I want, but within chipset features here, we'll turn off the auto configuration. We'll leave the AT bus clock just as clock divided by 4, that's the 32 MHz frontside bus, divided by 4, 7 something, that's where it should be. DRAM timing, we can't turn that right up. SRAM retiming, well, previously with the AMI BIOS, we could not get this any quicker than what it says there, 3222. But this time we can push it. And equally, we should be okay with 0 wait states on the right. That all seems good until you try to reset. We do have a minor problem. That being that the floppy drives don't work. Whatever floppy controller this BIOS is looking for is different from what's on this board. I have tried every Award BIOS that I can find over on RetroWeb suitable for this chipset. They're all exactly the same. Even some of the other AMI BIOSes are the same. This thing just must have some obscure floppy controller on it. Now hopefully we can work around that. In the meantime though, we can just press F1 to continue. And with that, like that, if we run speed sys now, well, you can see that there is now a clear definition between L1, L2 and memory. Confirmed by the results, data cache L1 16K 116 megabytes per second, data cache L2 512K, that's correct, 48.26 megabytes per second, and memory throughput 38.14 megabytes per second. Also confirmed, if we run cache check, that gives us results of L1 cache 136.3 megabytes per second, L2 cache 60.4 megabytes per second, and main memory speed 41.7 megabytes per second. So what am I talking about when I said that this board might be faster without the cache? We clearly seen there that the cache L2 was outperforming the system memory. Well, watch what happens when I remove this. All of the settings are exactly the same. If you run speed sys first of all, well, that graph looks interesting, doesn't it? Obviously have the super fast L1 cache in the CPU, then it just drops off and it's just reading from the system memory. And as you can see, memory throughput there, 46.26, just marginally slower than what we've seen running on the L2 cache, but considerably faster than what we've seen previously on the system memory. If we run cache check then, Last time, if I'm correct from memory, the L2 got about 60 megabytes per second. Well, while this throws exclamation marks at us, saying that we only have one bank of cache, we only have the L1 cache, look at that main memory speed. 60.2 megabytes per second. That is flying along. It certainly seems as if there's no need to have 512k of L2 cache. If anything, it's running at a similar speed to what the EDO does on its own. But that's only 512k. That's 32 megabytes. I'd rather have 32 megabytes of memory at 60 megabytes per second rather than just half a megabyte of it. Now I know what you're thinking. Glenn, that's just dodgy cache chips, still giving you problems. Well, I do have another set of cache here. These are definitely genuine chips. These came from Electromine. Granted, they're only 15 nanoseconds and only 128k of cache total. But let's fit these and let's compare the results. I haven't changed any of the BIOS settings. We're still running this at 2.111 timings, 0 wait state, and the DRAM is set up to its fastest possible speed. And again, it is just behaving exactly like the 512k did. Nice and fast on the L1 cache. Drops down to that sort of 45-50 megabytes per second in the L2, and then takes a further dip as it goes into the system memory. Confirmed again by the results. 116 megabytes a second on the L1. That's just been consistent. L2, 48 megabytes per second. Memory throughput drops down to 38. Let's run cache check again. And just like when we had the 512 in there, those results are pretty much the same. 136 on the L1, 60 on the L2, drops down to 41 on the system RAM. So this 128k of L2 makes the system perform more or less the same as this 512k. Obviously there's less of that there. I'm talking just purely in terms of memory speed. It was similar when reading from the L2 here or from reading from this L2. So I think that proves that those are real chips. They may not be 10 nanosecond as is written on them, but I would say in the worst case they're probably 15 nanosecond, the same as these ones. Regardless though, it does seem to be the case that this board just performs better with no L2 cache. Now yeah, the L2 when in there is marginally faster than what the EDO achieves on its own. But like I said, you've got either 128k or 512k of that only, whereas you have 32 megabytes of EDO there. So I do think it is better all around performance for the system to not have that L2 cache, to just have the EDO there that's running at more or less the same speed as the L2. I mean, when we ran cache check, there was only 0.2 of a megabyte per second in it, very little. But is that weird? It's certainly not something that I've came across before on a 486. It just seems to be the case that this Ali M1489 chipset is just really fast when running EDO RAM. Now, one of the comments that came out of the last video was, how does the EDO compare to FPM? I said we would test it, so let's just do that quickly. We'll remove the 32 megabytes of 60 nanosecond EDO and replace it with 32 megabytes of 60 nanosecond FPM. Now, I do expect this to be slightly slower. Let's find out by how much. So the EDO achieved 46.26. You can already see the FPM here on that graph is running slightly slower, but let's wait for the results to see exactly what it is. 33.29. So yeah, that has dropped off quite a bit. InSpeed says it has dropped by 13 megabytes a second, more or less. What about in cache check? Last time the EDO achieved 60.2 megabytes per second. Well, there it's dropped by exactly 15 megabytes per second, down to 45.2. If my MAS is correct, that's a drop of about 25%. So yeah, definite big difference between EDO and FPM. Let's get these out of here. And we'll go back to this stuff. Now, we've been running synthetic benchmarks, but what about real world? What's this done to our games? Let's try Doom, Duke 3D and Quake again. Let's see if they're any faster now. So it's ran the 2,134 game ticks in 1,553 real ticks. If you remember from last time, the calculation to change that into frames per second is game ticks 2134 multiplied by 35 and divide by the real ticks 1553, 48.09 frames per second. Last time when we ran Doom on that processor with the cache in there, we achieved 46 frames per second. So marginal increase, but granted all we've really done is remove the L2. Yeah, we have tweaked memory timings, but do keep in mind that last time we were running the DRAM at its fastest possible setting. The other memory timings in the BIOS are related to the SRAM. There's none of that fitted. What about Duke 3D? And for that we'll run Duke Mark Benchmark 2. I definitely do prefer this time demo benchmark now to both Doom and Quake, just because it gives us more real-time information. The purple number there, that's the current frame rate. The red, that's the lowest. Green is the highest, and blue is the average. So we've achieved a minimum of 20, maximum 83 and an average of 40. Comparing that to last time, we had a minimum of 19, so no real difference there. The maximum was 73, so a fair increase, although we only see that maximum very rarely. So just under 10% increase. That's not bad, considering, as I said, all we've done is remove the L2. We'll finish it out with Quake. Now, I don't think we'll see that much of a difference here. I think the limiting factor with this game is still the CPU. Or I suppose more accurately, the FPU within that CPU. This game pushes that hard. It's really looking for the Pentium. And yeah, there we are, 13.5 frames per second. Last time we achieved 13, so a very small increase. But yeah, it's still there, increase nonetheless. Now, speaking of that processor, when I bought that, I specifically went looking for this model. This is the BGC variant of that chip from 1998, so rather late in its production life. And the reason that I specifically went for that one is because I think we could push this further. I think we can overclock this. Now, at the minute, the board here is running with a 33 megahertz frontside bus. But if we modify this jumper block, and just let me remove the graphics card so that you can see it. This jumper block here, JP5 and JP6. If we open JP6, that'll change the frontside bus to 40 megahertz. The CPU takes that bus speed, multiplies it by 4 to give it its clock speed. So when it was running at 33, that's times 4, 133. We've changed it to 40 times 4. This should now be running at 160 megahertz. Let's see what that does to our performance. Well, let's see if it works, first of all. I'm hopeful that it will. As I say, it's a later chip. So by this point, all the silicone is well tested. It should be able to take the faster clock speed. Yep, there it goes. And 160 megahertz confirmed at post. Although it isn't getting any further. Just because it posts doesn't mean it's stable. It has froze here while initializing plug and play cards. It maybe doesn't like that faster clock speed. As silly as it sounds, let's just try the matrix here in a different PCI slot. That would be the plug and play card. Because one thing you need to keep in mind, while we have pushed the frontside bus out to 40 megahertz, that is also overclocking the PCI bus. In its standard form, PCI runs at 33 megahertz. We're pushing it to 40. The Mystic should be able to take it though. And I suppose equally, we are actually overclocking the ISA bus as well, which gives me another idea, considering that it did just hang again. If we jump into the BIOS and go to chipset features, let's change this to AT bus clock, because at the minute we're running it at clock divided by 4, so 40 megahertz divided by 4, we're running it at 10 megahertz. Maybe this card is the problem. Maybe this card doesn't like that. So we'll change it just to 7.19. Let's see if that makes any difference. No. A little bit disappointing, but what is falling over here? Is it one of these cards? Is it just the CPU can't take it? Or could it potentially be the RAM? I do have other sticks of EDO, so it isn't hard to swap them out. This is another 32 megabytes, 2 sticks of 16, and this is also 60 nanosecond stuff. Let's try that. Come on. Yes, it's booting now. So it must have been that memory. Obviously, as we've overclocked everything, we are further pushing the RAM. Those other 2 sticks just couldn't take it. But what's it done to our system performance? So we'll start with speed sys again. We see a nice improvement on the processor benchmark. But what about the memory tests? Certainly looks faster from what we can see here on the graph, but let's wait for the results. 140 megabytes per second on the L1 and memory throughput 55.75. That is quite an increase. It was about 45 last time, wasn't it? Maybe 46. A serious bump in memory performance as well as the CPU. What about cache check? And again, a healthy bump in performance. This time our L1 is rated at 163.6 megabytes per second, and the main memory speed jumps to 72.6. It was previously 60.2, so another big jump. This little board seems to love EDO RAM. Now, I suppose for completeness sake, we should try putting the 512K of L2 back in there, just to see what happens to these results. But before we do that, let's run the game benchmarks again. I actually wonder, will this be over 60 frames per second now? 2134 times 35 divided by 1301. Not quite. 57.4. Still very impressive. What about Duke? 27 minimum, maximum over 100, 101, and an average of 50. I know 50 frames per second doesn't sound like a lot these days, considering most people seem to be playing games at, what, 144 frames per second minimum to match up with their monitors. But back in these days, that was practically unheard of. If you got 30 frames per second, that was super smooth gaming. We're hitting 50 here. It almost makes me wonder if we could get away with increasing the resolution. We have been running all these games actually just at 320 by 200. But certainly in Duke here, I'm wondering if we could push it out. Maybe even to 640 by 480. I think we'll try that before the end. But what about Quake? Will this finally push this game into a playable frame rate? You can still see stutter in there when we're getting the lighting effects, you know, around explosions and all. That must be when the FPU is being hit. But it otherwise does seem very good. It seems very smooth. In fact, some sections seem quite fast. And obviously when you're running it in the game, you know, the frame rate won't run away with itself. So I dare think the stuttering wouldn't be as noticeable. 16.3. What were we before? 13.5. So almost an additional 3 frames per second. Yeah, I would say that pushes this game into the realms of playability. This is the shareware version of the game. So, I mean, I can try and play the first level. Granted, I've only got the keyboard here. But yeah, I mean, I would have been more than happy playing Quake like this back in the day. And in fact, if we just reduce the screen size that little bit, well, that just makes it all the more smooth. So let's try the benchmarks with the cache back in. And we'll just go with the 512K. Actually interested to see if this will even work, considering we have now overclocked everything. And now we're getting memory problems. Give it a reset. Yeah, it's not happy about something. So one thing we could try is going into the BIOS and slowing down the L2. Slowing down the SRAM. Change it to 3111, see what that does. Nope, still got the problem. I'll try 3222. No, it is not happy. I think it's just a case that that cache there just will not take the faster bus speed. Or I'm assuming it's the cache, because, you know, we haven't changed anything else about it. And it was all working fine a minute ago. Just want to try the 128K. And yeah, that's worked this time. Although I want to try and increase the memory speeds again. We'll just push it right out to 2111. That confirms that these chips here are definitely relabeled. And maybe they're actually 20 nanosecond rather than 15. Yeah, seems to be working again. So let's run speed sys and cache check. And yeah, just the same as when we ran the chip at 133 megahertz. So we've got the super fast L1, then we've got the L2, 58.15, and then the EDO memory throughput that drops off down to 45.96. If we remove the L2 though, the EDO memory throughput, it jumps up. It'll be at that 58 megabytes per second or thereabouts. And yeah, like I expected, the L1 cache is super fast. The L2, 72.7 megabytes per second, and then the main memory speed 50.2. But if I remove that main memory speed, it jumps up to the 70 megabytes per second. It just seems to be the case that this board works better with none of that. Okay, to finish off today, I want to see just how far we can push this. We've run the board at 33 megahertz and 40 megahertz, but we can go further. If I change this single jumper now from position JP5 to JP6, that increases the front side bus to 50 megahertz. Now that is really pushing the PCI bus out of spec, but hopefully the wee Mystique can take it. Question is though, can the CPU? Can this thing post at 200 megahertz? It's not working. But is that going to be the CPU or potentially the Mystique? I suppose there is one quick way to test it. If I open this jumper, that sends a 3x multiplier to the CPU. So in theory, it would boot at 150 megahertz. Granted 10 megahertz slower than what we were running it earlier. But with the 50 megahertz front side bus, everything else should be faster, and yes, it is booting. Although it now seems to be stuck at this screen. Tries to start MS-DOS and then doesn't go any further. So one last thing to try then. I have another stick of RAM. This is also EDO, but this is 50 nanosecond. The stuff that we've been using so far is all 60. Can the slightly faster RAM make the difference? This is just a 16 meg stick. I actually thought I had ordered 2 of them. In fact, I was convinced I had ordered 2 of them, but only one arrived, and then I went and checked the order, and it only said 1. They came from Electromine. Unfortunately, they don't have any more in stock now, so we're going to be stuck with just 16 meg if this works. And yes, it does seem to have. Now, just before we do jump into our suite of benchmarks, I just want to try it at 200 one more time. Would the different stick of RAM make the difference? Probably not, but I think it's worth trying. And no signal. I suppose there is one last thing. It is maybe taking a bit of a risk, but if we change the power jumper, if we try and force 4 volts into that chip, granted it's a 3.45 volt chip, rated for anything from 3.3 to 3.6, but if we do push it a wee bit, it might allow it to run a bit faster, or it might kill it. But we'll take our chances. Hopefully be okay with the big hefty heatsink on it. We'll not run it for too long though. Let's just see if it posts. No signal. I'll just turn that back down again, down to 3.45 again. But no signal. It doesn't seem that we can get 200. We'll just have to settle for 150 this time round. Granted, yes, 10 megahertz slower on the CPU, but 10 megahertz faster on the board. I do think it will make a difference. In the very least, I think it will perform similar. Let's find out. So yeah, that's actually quite a jump in memory throughput. I wasn't expecting it. L1 cache rate is about the same, but the system memory is now reading in SpeedSys 67.05. You can notice a slightly lower processor benchmark, just because it is running 10 megahertz slower, but the system memory does seem quite a bit faster. Cache check. And okay, this is showing us slightly slower L1 cache, presumably because, we're running the CPU slower, but the main memory speed has taken a jump. 81.9 megabytes per second. Last time it was 72.6. I really can't get over how fast the EDO memory is being accessed on this board. That is nothing short of impressive. But what's it going to do to our games? So Doom last time got 57.4. This time, $57.7, more or less the same. Very little in it. It's just a shame we couldn't get that CPU running any faster. You know, would it be possible to try and get a 3.5 multiplier into that? I'm not sure we can do that with the jumper configuration here. Typically you've got 2 or 3, that's it. Previously we had a 2x multiplier going into this, and that chip detects that and just makes it a 4x multiplier internally.
I'm looking good. Much better. Damn, I'm good.
And interestingly, this time we have seen a bit of a difference. Now granted, the minimum FPS has jumped from 27 to 28. So yeah, that's more or less the same. Maximum has went from 101 to 106, but it's the average. It's jumped from 50 to 53. So it definitely is running faster in this configuration. Despite the fact the CPU is 10 megahertz slower, the fact that the rest of the system is 10 megahertz faster, that is making the difference. Because this is more CPU limited or FPU limited, I actually don't think we'll see any difference here. In fact, this might actually be slightly slower. But yeah, 16.3 frames per second, exactly the same as it was last time. So there we are, one 486 board that seems to be faster with no L2 cache. Yeah, that is a first for me. But you've seen the results yourself. And granted, okay, the L2 when fitted runs at about the same speed as what the EDO does without it fitted. But at best, we've got half a megabyte of L2 cache in there. At the minute with 16 megabytes of EDO RAM. Better to have 16 megabytes running at the same speed as what half a megabyte did there. It just seems the best setup for this board is no L2 fitted. It's not without problems though, because well, we still don't have any working floppy drives. I've tried every award BIOS I can find and none of them will initialize the floppy drives. The only BIOS, in fact, that does seem to do it is the original AMI BIOS. But with that, we can't get the same performance out of it. So how are we going to fix that? Do we just disable the floppy drives and be done with it? Or do I perhaps introduce another controller card? You know, we can maybe use something like this big SCSI card, add a SCSI hard drive, and then we can plug our floppy drives in there. Not particularly keen on that, to be honest. I would rather just have it working on the board here. But short of modifying the award BIOS to make the floppy controller work that's on here, well, I'm not really sure what else to do. Why can't we just go back to the AMI BIOS? I hear you say. Well, I did try that and as odd as it sounds, even though there is no SRAM fitted, the overall system speed here is still governed by those SRAM timings in the BIOS. The only way this board will boot with its AMI BIOS is with the SRAM timings at 3222. It will not boot if I change that, even if there's no L2 fitted. And running at 3222, the memory throughput of the EDO here drops away off. We only get about 40 megabytes a second out of it. On the award BIOS, when I have that set to 2111, and yes, even when there's no SRAM fitted, that's what speeds up the access to the EDO memory. That's what's got us to, what was it last time, 82 megabytes per second. If I do go into the BIOS and turn that down to 3222, those memory results fall away. With the award BIOS, it slows down to similar figures to what we were achieving on the AMI BIOS. So one way or the other, the only way I can see to fix it is to modify one of them. Either we try and modify the original AMI BIOS to get this board to work with the faster memory timings, or we try and modify the award BIOS to get the floppy drives to work. And yeah, I know they're just floppy drives, you could do without them in this day and age, but I still find it handy just for transferring files across from my main computer to any of the retro builds that I'm working on. So I did have a think about that. If anyone has any thoughts, please let me know. But the other thing that we need to think about as well is what are we going to do with this? It needs to go in a case. And I know I said previously, we try and put it back in its industrial case, try and modify this in some way. But to be truthful, I am sort of having second thoughts there. I am sort of thinking that this maybe needs to go into a proper AT case and we'll make a proper build out of it, because it is turning into quite a nice system. Speaking of the overall build, I do have another couple of upgrades that I want to throw at it. We have another PCI card and a different sound card that I want to try. Those will be getting dedicated videos, and I think it's the PCI card that we'll look at next. That's this card. I want to put Voodoo in it. Since we've got so much performance out of the CPU, I think it would be well matched to have a Voodoo 1 in it. Although this card has obviously had a bit of a hard life. We have a couple of bent pins around the TMU, and in fact there might be one there around the FBI as well that I've just seen. But it's also quite dirty and needs a recap. At least a couple of these caps here have leaked quite badly. So that's what I want to look at next. I want to know if we could run Half-Life with a Voodoo on a 486. So if you'd like to see that video, make sure you are subscribed. And then the sound card video, well, no spoilers for that, but it is quite a rare wavetable sound card. It actually comes from the manufacturer of one of the systems that we usually focus on here on CRG. So let me know what you think about the BIOS. Let me know what you think about the case. I'm not sure we could push any more performance out of this board, short of modifying the clock generation system to try and get 60 megahertz front side bus. Might be worth looking at that, although to be honest with you, I'm not really sure if this board, or even if that chip would take it. That would be pushing the chip to 180 megahertz. Might just be too much for it. But again, if you have any thoughts on that, let me know. But I think that'll do us for now, because I'm starting to ramble here. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.